This
Yes.
is the Cultural Fluency podcast with Angèle Preto, the French coach. That's me. Today in episode number 5, I am with Joris Lechêne, another fellow French person who's going to speak only English to you. Well, at least today.
Yeah.
And yeah, you have built an impressive following on TikTok with over 100,000 followers. Congratulations for that. On a more local perspective, you are actually the first cisgender man to ever be on this podcast. So congratulations as well. I realized that. I was like, interesting. But you're not immune.
I don't think I deserve congratulations for that, but yeah. I just happened to be.
Yeah, well, it doesn't just happen in the sense that I tend to choose my guests based on the wealth of the perspective that they can share.
I got you. It makes sense now. Okay.
So it's not random. It doesn't just happen.
Yeah.
So I think, you deserve congratulations for that. However, you are not really immune to intersectionality yourself, which is how you end up on this podcast. And so because it's something you speak about a lot. So
Absolutely.
For the people who don't know you yet, can you introduce yourself? Tell us a bit what you're all about.
Ooh. Well, okay. I'm all over the place. This is me. Right. So I am French. I am mixed race or biracial, depending on which side of the Atlantic you are and whichever term you're more comfortable with. So yeah, I am white and Black Caribbean. Both sides are French, but one side is French Caribbean and the other one is French, white French. So that's where I'm from. I am based in the UK, so I now have dual citizenship. I am a fully Brit citizen, subject of Her Majesty the Queen, and I can't be kicked out by whichever policies that our current British government is trying to implement.
That's nice.
About myself, yeah. So I'm mostly active on social media where I make social commentary and I draw from my lived experiences of having lived and worked in 5 different countries, 3 different continents, and also both my experiences on both sides of privilege and disadvantages, and also draw from my multiple experiences of marginalization as a person of color, as a gay man, and also as a neurodivergent person because I have ADHD and I am on the autistic spectrum. And I like to draw parallels between those multiple experiences and see how they all boil down to power dynamics and the relationship between the dominant group or the norm and the marginalized or minoritized groups of which I am a part of.
So obviously you feel that being a part of those groups, as well as having had experience in different countries and different industries as well, that has shaped you differently as a person. Like that's like a huge opportunities for personal growth and generally,
Well, I don't know if it's opportunity. We will never know. It's like the saying of, trauma made you a stronger person. Well, we don't know because we don't know who we would be without that trauma.
Right.
So
yeah.
it's neither positive or negative. It's just part of who I am. And then, yes, I've managed and I've been lucky enough to be able to capitalize on those experiences in terms of social capital, because that's what I talk about on social media. And that got me quite a fairly big following, and also in terms of money capital, because that's also what I do for a living. It's talking and training and teaching about those experiences. So yes, it's core of my identity. It's made me who I am, and on top of that, I'm very lucky that I'm able to capitalize on it, which is a very rare occurrence within marginalized people. So I'm fully aware of my luck and chance and privilege.
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually one of the things I had on my list to speak about with you today. I think it was last week that you shared something about acquired privilege versus innate privilege. And I find that this is something that it is so not talked about. And it drives me nuts because people, especially in, left-wing or lefty spaces, I don't know how to call them, they have such a fixed mindset that they basically assume that you are born with a certain amount of fixed set of privileges, just like some people believe that it's fixed whether you're intelligent or not at birth, even though we know that it's not true. And it drives me crazy. Because, you basically pretty much check your privileges at the beginning, so maybe I should do the same. I'm obviously a white person, but other than that, I pass as male now, so I have male privileges, which I love. They're really cool, but I'm non-binary, I'm gender fluid. And I've lived as female, quote unquote, until I was 31, and then as male for the remaining, until now, basically, and I'm 36. But at this stage, I'm considering that I don't love being stuck in one gender. I fucking hate it, to be honest. I'm gender fluid, and I don't know if I should give up a part of my male privileges to be able to be more of myself, or if I should keep them because they're cool. So I guess it's like a case day by day thing, you know, and it's and also I've been able to capitalize on that a lot, because I said opportunity because it's like almost a sort of a deformation in my head that I can reframe everything as a positive. I am perfectly able to reframe being fired for being trans twice in 6 months as an opportunity, because I'm a business owner now and I love what I do, and I love how I've been able to capitalize on that. And I'm sure, like, I basically stopped being too involved with social justice just because of the people who would literally shun you if you would move too much away from the stereotype of like, oh, poor me, look at what happened, and the cow, like, oh, it's tiring.
Yeah, I'm in the middle of that right now, and yes, it's particularly frustrating. I always keep in mind that this is nothing in comparison to the kind of pushback that we get from conservatives and for bigots. But still, when it comes from within your ranks and within the people that you consider as part of your community sharing your values, it's much more difficult to deal with, because there's no room for debate and growth within our community, and that becomes very toxic. But when I say that, I want to make it clear that I'm not saying that, for instance, the left is more toxic than the right, because this is something that is very often then appropriated by the right, that they used to say, you see, the left is terrible, blah blah blah, and then they run away with it, and then we kind of like gave that weapon to them. So I'm conscious of that, but it is something to be talked about, when the lack of nuance within the left, it's a problem.
Yeah. And it's almost as if we don't want to get into our own nuances because we're afraid of giving weapons to like, you know, I wish people would understand what's like an internal discussion within the community and what is something like, it's almost like people can't have context.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah, and very often these normal healthy conversations and debates, they are portrayed as, you know, being cancel culture, being this or that, which is inherently racist, because when you use those terms to diminish and delegitimate some healthy conversations by calling them cancel culture, for instance, then you end up with us not being able to have those conversations. And then just to go back to what you said earlier about, you know, what the conversations we're having around privilege. And unfortunately, people are really good at spotting privilege in others, but whenever it comes to looking inwards and trying to realize the ways in which your position, you may have benefited from it in certain ways, all the while being marginalized, a lot of people are not ready for that. And a lot of people who claim to be leftist are not ready for that. And that becomes a really big problem, because I think that you cannot enter a space of marginalized people without first acknowledging your privileges and your positionality, your position in relation to those other marginalized identities. And that's something that I try to do all the time. And I feel like, yeah, not everyone is on the same page, and that's a problem.
Do you find that you have a lot of success in having people, trying to get people to acknowledge their own personal position and the privilege that they do benefit from? Or is it something that's an uphill battle every step of the way, which you're losing?
Well, that's
because I mean, my limited experience with that is like, whoa, waste of my time. But perhaps it's different for you.
It depends on the context. That's literally what my the trainings that I deliver on anti-racism, privilege, and bias, that's literally what they're based on. And that's what we spent a whole hour doing, is realizing how we all benefit from some privileges and some disadvantages. So it takes time, and it takes people to literally sit down and listen to you and take in what you have to say. So it works in in setups and in situations where I know I have 2.5 hours, 3 hours to talk to people, and I know I have the time to make my points, and I know the steps to get there. I don't go there straight away. So it can work, and it does work most of the time in those contexts. Now, if you look at social media and TikTok, and you know how you only have a few seconds to make a point, then there's not much room to make that case. So it's not that efficient, because all of those complex notions that take nuance and patience and attention, this is exactly what social media are built to avoid.
Right.
So I'm talking TikTok, I'm talking Twitter, where you have to catch attention and you have to go straight to the point, and it turns into slogans, which certain concepts do not fit into slogans, and then you end up with some like negative backlash when you know that the person would actually be on your side if they got your point, but they're not listening because they don't allow for nuance, and they already have this preconceived idea of what you're trying to say, because it sounds like something that they've heard before, but from bigots or from people who come with a completely different approach, and they will respond to that instead of actually engaging with what you actually said. So it can be very frustrating. So yes, it's a very positive experience in my work, but not so positive when it comes to what I do on social media.
Right, that makes sense. Yeah, that's why I personally am so afraid, and I kind of suck at social media, because I cannot be concise. I cannot make a small point. Like, it's not possible. Your point is always nuanced and contextualized, otherwise it's not a point. And that's totally why I wanted to have a 1 hour long podcast, because now we have time to speak about these things. And I'm actually very admiring of people like you who make, like, in 1 minute or in less than 1 minute, a point that is thought provoking. And but most of the time I want to take that point and have sit down with you, have a conversation to see if just pull it out. And like, I have a perfect example for that, because I've been through your TikTok this morning to prepare this interview. And in one of them, which was extremely short, you said, hot take, beauty privilege is the only privilege that society gives you but doesn't want you to know you have. And I'd really want you to elaborate on that, because I mean, I could be completely wrong, but I just don't see it. We just spoke about how privilege is invisible to the one who has it. That's like one of the main principles of privilege. And it appears that the whole of society is built on the fact that people have privileges but don't know that they do. And at the same time, you say that the only privilege that fits this description is beauty privilege. And I'm like, wait, how does that not apply to all the other privileges?
Okay, so first thing is, this is exactly what I hope to achieve when I post on social media. Yay! I don't expect you to get or to agree with me straight away, but I hope to start a conversation. And then I really appreciate when people are like, okay, I'm not sure I get the point, let's elaborate, because I love to do that. The problem is that a lot of people just see it and it's like, oh, well, it doesn't make sense because you said something different last time. I don't want to hear from you anymore because you're a hypocrite. And it's like, let's get some nuance. Let's get into the meat of it. Okay, so that was the first acknowledgement. And that actually answering your question. Yes, privilege is invisible to those who have it, but that doesn't mean that society necessarily wants you to not know about it. If we look at, for instance, white privilege, it is a privilege that the entire society relies on everyone being aware of it, to scare people so that people know their place. So many privileges, actually, it is difficult for the individual to know they have it, but society itself wants people to know about it so that everyone knows their place. And this is how you have class privilege, for instance, even though usually the holders of that privilege will not admit that they have it, but society will still tell you that it exists, and you better listen to it and you better follow it. You better follow that hierarchy that stems from it. So it is expected for the individual to know of that hierarchy.
So in a subconscious level, I'm sorry, yes. I don't mean to introduce, but like, it's more like they know it subconsciously and they act on it, even though they don't consensually, consciously acknowledge it. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, so yes. So let's say let's take any privilege. Let's say someone is holder of privilege, so they have privilege. It is usually socially rewarded for the person to acknowledge that they have that privilege. Let's say a white person,
right?
If they admit that they may benefit from their whiteness, it is usually well perceived, apart from far right and bigots and stuff like that. But it is usually perceived as someone being aware of their privilege, and it is rewarded by society. Right. If you acknowledge that you are wealthy and that it has consequences and that it may stem from injustice, it is usually well received and rewarded. But then if you start talking about beauty privilege and you acknowledge that your conventional attractiveness gives you some advantages, then it is very often received as, who the fuck do you think you are? Well, you're not all that. You're not that sexy. You're not that beautiful. And the response very often misses the point that you're not calling yourself, you're not passing judgment on your look, because very often you can be aware that you benefit from beauty privilege and still hate yourself and hate the way you look. So those two things are different. But so yeah, instead of being received as, the result of structures in society, because we don't choose the way we look, but we can be aware of the many ways that we benefit from it. But this is a conversation that is considerably more difficult to have when we talk about beauty privilege than other privileges. Yeah, I don't know if that explains.
No, it does. Yeah. That is so interesting. Why do you think that is? Like, why would we specifically single out beauty privilege as opposed to any other one?
I think because it probably stems from good intention. The thing is, if there's a negation that beauty is a social marker. Why? It's because we want everyone to feel, or at least the idea is that we don't want people to be disappointed or to be disheartened by the idea that beauty is an absolute and that you either have it or don't have it. So to counter this narrative, people have come up with the idea that, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, beauty is subjective, so there is no such thing as beauty. We are all beautiful in our own way, which stems from a good intention, but at the same time, it negates the social factor, the fact that in our society, it is a tangible thing that either benefits you or may further marginalize you, depending on whether you fall within that norm or outside of it. So there's a confusion when we talk about beauty privilege. It is received as a brag and not as the acknowledgement of a power dynamic that is built by society and that we're not responsible for, but that we can look into how we may benefit from it or be marginalized by it. So it's probably this misunderstanding, but because it touches on the core of who you are and how you see yourself, it is much more comfortable to just see beauty as this subjective thing that has no tangible effect, as opposed to beauty as a social construct that does determine your position in society.
Yeah, no, I think I get it. It's almost like people can't make a difference between beauty, which is in the eye of the beholder, which you can have a subjective perception, and a conventional attractiveness, which by definition is conventional, and people agree on it. Like personally, for me, the way that I perceive beauty, I guess because I'm a trans person and I'm also queer and whatever, I have a really hard time perceiving conventional attractiveness as beauty. Like, it's something I see the difference very easily because I can find someone very beautiful and know that they're not conventionally attractive, where at the same time, I can know that the person is conventionally attractive because I know what criteria, but I look at that person like what? Like, for example, I made a series of videos about Bradley Cooper, who was elected the sexiest man alive in 2011, and the French went crazy over it when that happened. There were like a number of interviews, which are something to react to on YouTube, which is what I did. And I understand that for a man having been called the sexiest man alive, he has to fit very tightly in the criteria of conventional attractiveness. I see, okay, like he's symmetrical, yeah.
And that's the thing. Talking about beauty as a social construct doesn't mean that we're talking about your tastes. So you can have completely different tastes from the conventional beauty and still acknowledge that there is such a thing as conventional beauty, which you may disagree with, but you can still have that conversation. You can be attracted for a certain type of people that are not conventionally attractive and are less likely to benefit from beauty privilege. So those are two different things, but people can very often struggle to separate the two.
Right. How do you feel that beauty privilege intersects with racism in your case?
Well, that's how many hours have we got?
Normally 1 hour total, but we can make a second episode if you want.
The beauty standards are built around whiteness as the default. Therefore, existing outside of those standards, that automatically already gives you, weighs you down already. I think I am the example of someone who started as a person of color, therefore invisible, especially the part of my life, the part of my youth that I spent in a white majority society, that I spent in mainland France, because I grew up in Guadeloupe in the Caribbean, and then I moved to mainland France. So I really experienced two different experiences of two different societies, one Black majority society and then moving to a white majority society. So, and then I became invisible. It's not even that I was ugly, it's that I was invisible. I wasn't on anyone's chart of beauty, right? So this is an experience that I'd ended up internalizing that I was not even on any scale of beauty, and that therefore I was, because I was a person of color, and I'd internalized that I could not be perceived as attractive unless by someone who's exceptional and someone who happens to be extremely open-minded. So it is something that I carried through puberty, and I entered my adult life with those internalized perception of extremely negative perception of me not having beauty at all, not benefiting from that. And I think probably as a trauma response, I then took my career towards modeling. And I think that's one of the reasons why I got into modeling was also a way of reclaiming my beauty. And it turns out that I was fairly successful into modeling. So this is also why I'm so confident in talking about beauty privilege and how one might benefit from it, because I was a model for 15 years, even maybe more. Yes. I still technically, I'm a model. I am represented by agencies, and if I'm available, then I will do the jobs. But now my other career as a trainer on anti-racism keeps me busy, earns me much more money. So I don't really consider myself as a model anymore, but I am fully aware of how I've benefited from it. I've lived off it for years and years. So how could I not say that I benefit from beauty privilege? Of course I have, but that's also a response to me being on the other end of the beauty privilege as a person of color in a white society, as someone who was considered and had internalized that I did not have any beauty at all. So again, it's another example of how something negative, I was able to turn it into a positive, but I'm still very careful to not say that it helped me, because I don't know where I would be in life if I hadn't experienced that trauma in the first place. And who knows, I might even be further in life and more successful in a way. So we would never know. All I can tell you is that, I've turned that trauma into something that benefited me, but I don't know if I would have benefited more if I hadn't had that trauma.
Yeah, and also, I mean, clearly you fit in a certain idea of beauty, even though it's not a white one, because otherwise you wouldn't have been able to have a career as a model.
Absolutely.
And I'm wondering if it's something recent. I'm sorry, just go ahead.
No, carry on.
I'm wondering if it's something rather recent that we tend to have more diversity in modeling now than we did when you and I grew up, or if it's just something that's more visible because of the internet.
I would say it's recent, and there has been an appetite for diversity, I would say, in a certain way. The problem with that is that it doesn't mean liberation and it doesn't mean equality, because we see that if you look at the history of Brazil, for instance, Brazil was a country that was built on the myth of a post-racial society. And in some ways, maybe well, not really the United States, because they were very happy to divide. But in Brazil, you have sort of the opposite. So it's all built on the dream of a post-racial society. We are not white, we are not black, we are all mixed, and it's beautiful, and look at us. But then very quickly you realize that that myth is actually just a tool to negate the existence of racial disparities and the existence of racial oppression, and the fact that the elites are white and the oppressed are black in Brazil. Because, oh, we're all the same, we're all on the same boat. No, we're not. But it was, apologies for the sirens, I live in the hood.
It's okay.
So yeah, we have the example, so I'm using the example of Brazil, but that applies everywhere in the world. So we have to be very careful, because there is an aspiration to this ideal of mixity. Is mixity a word in English? I don't know.
Maybe.
Miscegenation, but yeah, in the diversity and dilution of races, it is something that a lot of people aspire to, but that does not mean end of racism. It's very quickly becomes a tool of racism, because it negates people's experience. It aligns with I don't see color. So, you know, like, yeah, I accept you regardless of your color. But when you say I don't see color, you're also saying I do not recognize that your racial identity has an impact on your position in society and on your experience of society.
Yes.
So it becomes a very toxic discourse. And I think that the same in modeling and also in advertising, this boom and this trend of representing diversity, that can very quickly lead to, oh, well, yeah, we are very diverse. There's no more racism. Let's move on and shut up. You can't say that we're racist, so we can't address the issues, because look at how diverse we are. So yes, there is probably more diversity in representation in the media, especially in fashion, in modeling, and in advertisement. But that doesn't mean the job is done. We have to be extremely careful, because this can be a tool of oppression as well.
Yeah, it's something that unfortunately I'm extremely familiar with as a trans person.
Yeah.
Because the same way that people don't see color, they also don't see gender and don't see a difference between cis and trans. But the same people who say that, they will very happily enforce sexism on a trans man, pretending that they're not doing it. And if you don't see it, how can you behave so differently to men and women and chuck me together with women in one category? You have to be seeing something.
Yes. Yeah. And yeah, I've not experienced it firsthand, but I've witnessed it happen. I've witnessed trans men being in the way they were being addressed to. You could see that it stems from misogyny, because they were perceived still as women by the people who were attacking them, and they were treating them as such. So it becomes very complex, because you want to recognize the trans person's identity, but you also know that they experience oppression from all sides of their identity, and then denied all of those identities at the same time, all the while being oppressed for them. So it's
you know, that's why I'm terrified of trying to live as gender fluid and having more people know that I'm not a cis man, or especially a cis het man. It's terrifying, because I've lived through that. I almost died, and you know, like, depression is real, and now I'm stronger, I hope, but it feels like it's a double-edged sword. And I'm wondering, I mean, we had this conversation quickly at some point. I'm wondering if it's worse in French-speaking situations, or like in France, as opposed to English-speaking situations, because it feels like the French speakers are 10 years backwards compared to the people who can get their information in English. But
well,
you're in a great position to tell me about that.
Well, actually, I was literally about to say you would have to tell me, because when it comes to gender debates, I don't know.
Gender or racism.
I don't really know much about what happens in France. Yeah.
I actually don't know much either,
yes.
because I live in Austria. I used to live in, like, the whole being trans thing happened in Germany. So I don't actually know how it is in France. But I know how I interact with French people when I meet them. It's just a small subset. And but the thing with race, particularly in France, it's horrendous. Like, people will say the race has no scientific basis, which is true, but then they'll leave the conversation at that. Like, this is not a point about science.
It's like, we can acknowledge that race has no biological foundation, and at the same time recognize that it is also a social construct that does have really concrete results on people's lived experiences, but usually we stop at that. And I have many questions to ask you, but this is not because
sure,
like for instance the
it's a relaxed conversation,
thing
so
in French I have no idea how we navigate it in French. That's, how do you have they, them? What's the equivalent in French? And how do you degender in spoken French? How does that work? But I don't know.
Mostly you don't, but I just gave a class on YouTube Live yesterday about that. So if you have an hour, you can go watch that. And it's very nuanced, and I got mad because of the écriture inclusive, which is I never loved the concept. I was like, I don't think we need that. But then I started doing research because I was asked to teach it from my viewers. And it drove me completely mad, because it's not just useless, which would not be a big problem. It's counterproductive. It's counterproductive in two ways, because one, it gives some ammunition to the bigots to, like, pretend that the feminists are taking over the world. And that's a bad backlash to have, when we already had ways to speak in French that are gender neutral, thanks to all the numerous formulations that we have, which can be used by any gender. Things like ça me plaît, or the adjectives like agréable or magnifique, which don't change from masculine to feminine. And we basically had everything we needed. In my last day job, which I got fired from for being trans, I was actually in charge of making the text gender neutral. So that was why I was hired, and also why I was fired. You'd gotta love that.
What?
Yeah, no, it's real. It's real. Then they came up with the écriture inclusive, which I understand where it stems from, but it's not necessary. It triggers discussions that we don't need to have. And worse than that, it is all based on the idea of giving women more visibility. It's not to make the language gender neutral, which would be a good thing. It's to give women more visibility. Now, I have nothing against women. I think they should, be encouraged more and everything. Like, I love women too. So, but do you really have to push down any kind of other, like, social category as you try to uplift women?
It's reinforcing the binary instead of liberating from it.
Yes.
This is so interesting. Yeah, it totally makes sense to me. So obviously I'm not speaking on the trans experience, and I'm not speaking on the debates that are happening in France around that, because I am not informed and I'm not in a position of having an opinion on that. But I can draw parallels with racism and the debates around racism. And I totally can relate to this notion that sometimes if the intent is to progress, we end up blurring the lines and having completely unproductive debates. And I have this example of, it's not actually in France, but I'm sure the same happens in France. But in some of the trainings that I was delivering, I talk about racism and anti-racism and all the dynamics of it all. And somebody told me, well, I'm very confused. I don't understand, because 20 years ago, we were told that we should no longer use the terms black coffee or white coffee. So those were people who were working in catering, and their bosses had told them that to no longer use black or white coffee because it was offensive, because it was racist. And then we have to pick up the pieces from that, because this is exactly what happens when people who are not who are in position of privilege and who are not part of a marginalized identity feel entitled to make decisions on behalf of those marginalized people. And all they end up doing is further confusing people, further bringing, throwing fuel into the fire of misconception and misunderstanding, because that person who was talking to me was completely understandably confused, because they ended up perceiving the fight against racism as a fight of some completely random words are nowadays forbidden because that's racism. How do you expect them to understand what racism is and the dynamics of repression and how it serves, how race was built to serve the privilege and to serve the economy of capitalism? They will never get there, because their first experience of being not racist was that they were told to not use the term white coffee or black coffee. So yeah, and I can totally imagine that the same kind of unproductive and constructive discourses may happen around gender as well. So yeah,
I mean, around gender, it's mostly the pronouns. And like when I had my last day job where I struggled so much and eventually I didn't manage to keep myself in the company, the well-meaning colleagues who were really trying to be nice, they were obsessed over pronouns. And me, especially at the time, I didn't care. I was like, it's not about the pronouns. Like you can't, like, I want you to stop being a sexist, okay? It's not about what pronoun you use. The pronoun is a small word. It's your entire behavior that, you need to readdress. Don't dismiss me when I speak. If you're gonna, it's not a pronoun, and it's tiring. And I'm really annoyed that a lot of the debate, quote unquote, ends up being a debate on words. So whether so it's white coffee or black coffee or a pronoun, it boils down to people think that racism is in speech. Now it can be in speech, sure, but it's like a very small, and the same for sexism and transphobia and all of that. Like when we are complaining that trans women are killed in the US on a now probably weekly basis, because it used to be monthly, but it's increasing. They are not complaining about someone who didn't respect their pronouns. They're complaining about someone who killed them and will probably be let off with a light sentence if we even, sentence them at all, because they had trans panic. What the hell? Like this has nothing to do with a fucking pronoun. What the hell?
Yeah, and this is the problem of individualizing a system of oppression instead of looking at how society in general contributes to oppress people. We are turning it into a person. So racism is not the ways in which people of color are more likely to be incarcerated, to be arrested, and all of that. No, racism is a member of the KKK. So it's very convenient for people to look at the most extreme version of personal, overt, intentional racism, because they're like, oh well, I'm not like them, therefore I'm exempt. I'm not a racist. And I believe that it's probably very much the same when it comes to transphobia. There is this notion of a transphobic person. People look at them and they're like, well, I'm not like that. I don't think that trans people should be killed. Therefore, I'm good. And I don't need to examine the ways in which I may have benefited from my gender privilege, from being cis, or etc. etc. So
I mean, they don't think trans people should be killed, but they also don't think that trans people should be hired or kept within a team. So
or they think that trans people make it always about their transness, or they think that they should disclose it in at the first date or things like that. So they don't perceive themselves as transphobic, but they're happy to be the vehicle of the ideas that lead to trans people being murdered. So
and they aren't willing to look at their own behavior and acknowledge how they behave differently. Like, for example, the reason why I was fired last time was because of communication difficulty. And so when I went to speak to a trans advocate person and tried to find a lawyer and so on, because it was completely illegal, the person asked me, okay, like, but were they indeed communication difficulty? Like, is this a real reason to, like, is this true that there was? And I was like, oh yeah, I was fired on a Friday, and on a Monday, the company was expecting an outside counselor person to come and talk to the entire team to fix the communication difficulties that the entire team had. So of course there was communication difficulty. However, only one person was fired over it, me.
And what you say, obviously I can't speak on your experience, but that also resonates with me in a particular way as a neurodivergent person, because being rejected or fired or dismissed for communication difficulty is also the lived experience of autistic people with ADHD, and that is very often also the reason that is invoked to push them aside. And yeah, so and that it might be a combination of all of them. Everything that puts you outside of the norm, that will be presented or interpreted as communication difficulties, and Black people also experience that. You know, how they are very often perceived as aggressive, as too direct, as not having the codes to really be appropriate in a professional context. All of those are excuses that have their roots in racism and that are justified, and also wrapped into this notion of communication differences, cultural differences. So it's the intersection of all of those. As soon as you are not part of the norm, then that would be presented as, no, it's not because you're this, it's just that, you know, it's not a match. It's, we don't understand each other. Of course you want to understand each other because you have different experiences of society, but that should not be a base for firing someone or dismissing someone. That should be a signal that, hey, maybe we are not inclusive in the way we work and the way we expect our employees to work. So yeah, it's great that they had this communication expert coming in, but why did they have to fire you if they acknowledge that there is an issue?
Well, so, yeah, because it's not because of that. I mean, and the whole team knew, because at that point I had already gotten fired 6 months before from another company. So I knew what all the fuss was, and I was able to speak to people around me, and the entire team knew. Another good sign I find that you've been fired for something illegal is if the reason they give you for the firing is different from the reason they give to your team for why you were fired, which is what happened to me in my first job. I was like, I was told that the reason why I was getting dismissed, not technically fired because it was in Austria and you can't just fire people. So they made me sign a contract that, like not a contract, but a paper saying that I was happy to leave, which I was happy at this stage because they had made me go through hell, through HR meeting after HR meeting to find out what they would do with my case. And when they presented me a paper, which was like, yeah, you can have like, you know, unemployment benefit and be out of this hellhole, I was like, yes, like, let me sign, you know? But apparently the reason was that the entire team hated me and they didn't know what to make of me, because that was the reason why, you know, like I was unable to relate to the entire team. But the same team with whom I spoke after the fact, because I had their contact, told me that I was fired because I couldn't handle the stress. And I will admit that at this point, after, you know, 2 or 3 months of like this, like just grinding and coercion, yes, I was very stressed out. This is true.
Of course. So it's placing so it's like such a typical mechanic of oppression. So first they oppress you, and then they blame you for the way you handle being oppressed.
Yes.
And they make it your problem instead of looking at the way the ones who are doing the oppression or the abuse. And it's literally, it's an example of abuse as well. And that's exactly how abuse works. The abuser will do the abuse and then blame the victim for responding to that abuse. It's absolutely, it's terrifying.
And so that's how, after I had this experience twice, and I was honestly like, I'm either going to transition or to die. And if I'm going to transition, it will take me years and I won't have an ID and I will be outed anywhere that I try to get a job. So I'm not going to go through that, like, because it's going to kill me. And another option would have been to try and ask the German government for money, which they would have paid me if I was German or if I had worked in Germany more than 1 year. But unfortunately, I got fired so fast that I didn't have enough work experience in the country. So, because the first time I was fired was in Austria. And it's Europe, so in theory, you can like move papers around from country to country, but I don't know a single person who has succeeded. I know a lot of people who have failed. And so I was only left with the option of starting a business, which is what I did. And I'm very happy now, and I acknowledge that I'm very privileged to just sit at home and literally be the boss of me and of, you know, my team whenever I work with someone else. And this is privilege that I have built, like, you know, through blood, sweat, and tears, literally, which is why I'm so passionate about the innate versus acquired privilege discussion.
Yeah. And would you say that your ability to transition or not determined where you would live, and or that's completely unrelated? Because
No,
I'd imagine that, yeah.
It's not related for me. However, I had a really fun plan, because when I first decided to transition, there was no law in France that allowed me to change my gender. So yeah, basically there was no law at all. And the people who tried, at the end of the day, it came down to either compulsory surgery, or just sometimes it was just rejected, even for people who had that surgery, because they thought that the identity is like set in stone. And in France, you're not allowed to change your name. It's not just your gender marker, it's your name as well. Unless you can, you're de facto not allowed to do it, basically, because your name is not, disponibility.
And that's still the case today.
They have made it less bad, because of all the trans people who were rejected, despite having fully transitioned, even surgically and everything. The EU has been badgering France for 10 years, telling them that this is against human rights and they have to do something. So halfway through my transition, or 2 or 3 years after, 2 years after I had started to transition, they created a law which then allowed me to change my gender. And I was quite lucky, because the law is vague. And so it kind of depends on whom you meet and who's looking at your file. But I acted out like the straight man role very well in court, and therefore they let me through. But I got lucky that it happened at that point. Before that, I had a plan of acquiring the German citizenship through being married with my ex-wife. And then after that, using the German law, which did exist, to change my gender, which would have taken a lot more time.
So the law in Germany is more accommodating to trans people than in France?
Not anymore. Because the law in Germany is 20 years old, and the law in France is only 2 years old now.
Okay, but that's crazy that it took France so long compared to Germany, which is typically perceived as a less progressive country when it comes to gender and sexual orientation. I don't know if they have gay marriage now. But
they do now. If they 2 years.
Okay, okay, so that's fairly recent, right? So
yeah, I actually wasn't officially married. I was officially in how can I call that in English? Like a recorded partnership. Yes, a civil partnership, if you will. Yeah, because I was legally female and my wife as well at that point. Which is crazy, because if we had gotten married, if we had gotten signed the paper 2 months earlier, we would have been married, because she was legally male. But then she changed her marker and I still had my female marker, so we were same sex. And then I changed mine, so we were straight again.
Wow. Okay.
Same couple, 3 options.
Yeah, 3. Wow. Okay.
Well, and we weren't even together all that long. We were together 3 years and a half total.
Yeah, the hoops that you have to go through.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm actually shocked to realize how backwards France still is. I mean, you're saying that this is getting better now, but yeah, I had no idea that up until recently it was so bad still. Not saying that it's great now.
I mean, the law is better, but I don't live in France, so I can't really tell. But I'm very happy to be in stealth, that I can tell you. And but I'm happy privilege-wise. I'm not happy in my identity. That's a problem.
And is transitioning covered by the healthcare system in France or in
yeah, I'm pretty sure it is. I haven't done it myself, but I'm positive that it is. Yeah. Also in Germany, I mean, all over Europe. Yeah. So.
Okay.
But you can be covered by healthcare and still have to find a way to support yourself through it. That's 2 different things. And they have a good system for, if you're unemployed or anything, but you can easily fall through the crack if you have moved countries, or if you haven't worked enough, or if you're too young or too old or whatever. It's so kind of crazy. It's kind of crazy when you think about it.
If on top of that you happen to be, let's say, a migrant or someone who has, for whatever reason, has troubles to prove, the legality of their existence, then that intersects, and that ends up making it worse. Yeah,
that's how in France we have so many trans sex workers who are in that situation. Because no papers, or like papers that aren't the right ones, and it's a mess. It's a nightmare. And of course, like if you're an quote unquote illegal immigrant or you're undocumented, you're very likely to also not be white.
Of course,
right?
of course. Yeah.
So you don't have that as well.
Yeah, so this is how we see the intersection of your racial identity and your gender identity intersect, and that makes you even more marginalized.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, which is one of the reasons why, like, I think it's important when you're a marginalized person to acknowledge the privilege that you do have, because it's the only thing that you can leverage. Like, I mean, if you have an interest in like getting out of the hole that society has put you in, what you need to look is like, okay, in your hole, what do you have that you can possibly use as a ladder? Because
absolutely,
for me,
yes.
being white and being able to pass as male and even having male documentation now, I know it's something that I'm using. And in, for example, building an online business, I know I have a tremendous advantage from passing as a white male.
Yeah,
because
you get access to more circles, to more spaces in which you can advocate for people who do not have your privilege.
Yeah, but like, so for example, people don't criticize my prices. Like I've almost never had a client look at me and be like, oh, that's too expensive. And I'm very expensive, like compared to, you know, the average person who teaches French online. And I'm sure this is a male privilege, because every single woman that I've been in a money mindset class with will say how people think that, pretend that she's too expensive, even though technically women are less expensive than men. And it's,
yeah, and this is exactly, you cannot challenge the structures of oppression if you don't acknowledge and understand the ways in which oppression applies differently to different people, and is not felt uniformly. The problem is that, you know, a lot of people, that usually implies that you have to recognize the ways in which you may benefit from it.
Yeah.
And some people are very quick to say, oh, white people, they don't really want to recognize how they participate in racism. People of color may say that, but when you go to them and tell them, okay, but do you also acknowledge that you may benefit from male privilege, for instance, or stuff like that, then suddenly, oh no, they don't want to do that. And then they accuse you of sowing division among the oppressed. But yeah, as you said, yeah, you can challenge and deconstruct a form of oppression if you don't realize what role you have in it, what position you have in it, given to you by the system. So it doesn't mean that, you know, you don't, that it's necessary. You need to acknowledge the tools that you have at your disposal to deconstruct it. And in order to do that, you have to look at your privilege as well. You have to look at the spaces that you have access to. You have to look at the people who are willing to listen to you.
Yeah, no, I also a form of privilege that I have is that people actually come to my, you know, YouTube live and classes, and when I talk, they listen. And so I can speak about topics like privilege and things like that. I don't speak about it a lot because I don't want that to become the core of what I do, because I've been speaking about it in the past and been hit very hard. And like the whole point of using your privilege to advocate is that you don't lose your privilege in the process, because otherwise it's pointless.
Absolutely. And yeah, unfortunately, so many people don't get that. And then they will look at you and they'll be like, you should do more. You could do more. Why don't you do more?
Can't.
You're still in a privileged position. And it's like, yeah, but you have to negotiate. It's a compromise between losing it and still keeping enough of it so that you can turn it into a tool of deconstruction. And there is no right way of doing it. So, but it's important to know that we're trying to figure it out all the time. So when people accuse you of still having privilege, it's like, yeah, but you can't give it all up, because then you
have it internalized as well. Yeah, and you have it internalized as well. So every step of the way, you have to fight yourself to figure out what you can do and what you can't do. So for example, I started wearing nail polish again, like 2-3 weeks ago, which I hadn't done for years. And I was terrified at the beginning, and I didn't really have a reason to be. Like, people kind of tend to appreciate it, but who knows, like, how much is too much? Like, when I started being like exploring my gender, you know, a couple of months before I got fired, I started wearing binder. I started using, you know, male shower gel, things like that. And the first, few weeks, nothing happened. No one even mentioned anything. And we're like, okay, this is fine. I can continue. And then you don't know what flips the switch, but the switch has flipped somehow. And but I mean, I did get fired eventually. So
yeah,
I don't know what, like it's terrifying because, and also the people who are doing it, like, the people who fire you or whatever, they're covering up their asses in the process so that they can't be sued, or ideally can't. I mean, in Germany, you can't sue people because there isn't a single competent lawyer. So there's that. But in Austria, probably I could have. Or also it was a much bigger company, so they were more equipped to cover themselves. And and it was the first time it happened to me. So you're caught in a whirlwind of not even knowing what happens. It's just, it's terrifying. And then when you intersect it with the being neuroatypical as well, like we haven't spoken about that so much. It's something I would have loved to hear a bit more. Maybe we can just switch to that. I don't love diagnosis. I don't see the point, but then I feel I have no legitimacy to call myself whatever, because I don't know. Like, I think the diagnosis that fits me best is CPTSD. Because when I read the list, and because I know that ADHD and a number of others, like CPTSD can look a lot like ADHD. I'm thinking maybe I don't have ADHD, but I relate to it because of CPTSD. And I don't know if I should spend more time exploring that and if that would benefit me, or if it's something that I should just be like, that doesn't really define me. And it's difficult because I love labels. And actually, we haven't spoken about labels because we both love them, so we don't need to have the conversation. But what do you do with that? Like, are you officially diagnosed yourself from being for being ADHD and autism, or is it something that you found out?
My whole neurodivergence journey is very long. But yeah, at first, in France, I was diagnosed as gifted, so surdoué, when I was a child.
So that's a diagnosis in France. Fuck, that is something about our culture.
That's the thing. Like, it has the meaning in France and in the medical circles in France that does not exist, for instance, in the UK, or at least I haven't found it. So I've used the same word or the translation for surdoué in the UK, which is gifted, but I've realized that people responded to it completely differently. And
because we think it's a good thing in English.
Well, it's so I've spoken to psych professionals, and it was in the context of therapy. So I brought it up, and all the time the response was, oh, so what is your gift? If you say you're gifted, what do you mean by it? And it was very confusing to me, because why would you ask, like, you're the psychology professional, why are you asking me what I mean by it? Like, it's not a term that I invented. It's a label that has, so that's the confusion, because in France it is, so when you use that word, people know what it means. So yeah, it's a form of a different form of intelligence, and that manifests itself with this and that. Whereas here it's like, oh, so you're talking about the gift that you have. What is your gift? And I was like, what? I'm not talking about having a gift. I'm talking about giftedness as the neurotype.
Yeah, they didn't know.
So yes, so that's when I realized, okay, that's going to be a long journey, because if each term is different, has a different meaning in the countries, that's going to be great. So yeah, I was diagnosed as gifted as a child. So I was told from a very young age that my intelligence was different. And it's even more complicated to navigate, because the whole notion of intelligence is something that I reject, and I think we should all reject. But at the same time, again, in certain contexts, it is useful to describe your identity and your reality and your different perception of society and your relationship with it. Anyway, so yeah, I knew that I was different. I knew that I was wired differently. I knew that I experienced emotions differently from most of the people around me. So regardless of what you name it, it is something that I knew. I've always felt different because of that. But then it's fairly recent that I started revisiting that experience and started to be interested in putting more fitting labels onto it, especially when I realized that the label gifted in the society that I lived in, namely in the UK, has absolutely no meaning or a completely different meaning. So I was starting trying to, okay, what is the label that would fit me here? And then that's why when I realized that a lot of what was understood as part of giftedness in France fell within what was understood as ADHD in the UK. Mm-hmm. So that's when I realized that everything, that all the criteria, or almost all of them, not all of them, but that's a twist that I would get to later, but most of them completely fitted me. So that's what I started seeking for diagnosis. And for your audience in the UK, there are two healthcare systems in a way. There's the public one, which is free, mm-hmm. but you have to wait, and then private. So if you have the money, you can get an appointment very quickly. So I've pursued both avenues. I mean, I first tried to pursue the public avenue, but there was a waiting list for diagnosis. And fun fact, it's been 3 years and I'm still in the queue. So there's that.
Wow.
Yes. And then, but obviously after a few months, I was like, well, I'm not gonna wait. Like, mm-hmm. I need to move on with my life. So I ended up going through a private psychiatrist who officially diagnosed me. So yeah, so I've got ADHD diagnosis. Now, autism is the same story, except that I haven't had the spoons, the time, the energy to start this process all over again for autism. And what is interesting is that is through the ADHD process with the public sector, they were making me, I must have had 5-6 interviews talking to 6 different people, every time telling the same story. So every time it's like a stage thing. So you like, mm-hmm. you pass this first stage, so now they allow you to meet that other person.
Like being trans.
So that you can, I can imagine, yeah. And it's ridiculous because all of those stages only to put me on a list that 3 years later I am still on. So it's like
insane,
such a waste of public money and a waste of people's energy as well, because like obviously that completely grinds you down. But yeah, where was I getting? Oh yeah, so through each of those stages, there was always at some point someone mentioning, okay, but what you're describing sounds a little bit like Asperger, or sounds mm-hmm. a little bit like autism, you know? And at the time, I was very dismissive of it, not because I didn't believe them, but because I felt like if they start taking me into that direction, that means that would take me away from my ADHD diagnosis. And I wanted that diagnosis to have access to medication to try and mitigate the negative effects of ADHD. So I was very focused on, which is ironic, I was focused on ADHD. I was extremely concentrated and attentive to go towards ADHD diagnosis because of that medical reason. So at the time, I took it as a threat to be, not that I didn't believe that I might be on the autistic spectrum as well, but I thought, okay, they're going to divert mm-hmm. me from getting where I want to get. And it's only now that I have that diagnosis that I can like calm down and look calmly. And I'm like, yeah, absolutely, there is autism in that.
Because you have the space for that now. And you have the acquired privilege for your ADHD diagnosis to look into your autism. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. So yeah, that's a great example of acquired privilege, actually. So yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, exactly. So now I have been able to look into that as well. And also social media had a huge role in it, because first of all, it made me aware that there were such things as people with both ADHD and autism. Because at first I was like, okay, but autism seems to fit as well, but I can't be everything. Mm. I can't have every possible neurodivergence. Yeah. Yeah. So I completely relate. So meeting or being in touch with people who actually live that experience made me realize that, yeah, it is a thing. It's not just me taking all the labels that exist and applying them to me because I like attention. It's like, okay, some people actually live that, and it sounds a lot like my experience. So I think that's what I am too. And so yeah, researching, and I'm gonna take away researching, because usually it's very negative, like, oh, you need to do your research on COVID by going on Facebook. So yeah, no, not researching.
You always need to do research on everything. Like, it's not negative to me. It's what I do all day, every day.
Of course, but when people say, oh, I've done my research, nowadays what they mean is I went on Facebook and somebody told me that, you know, some horse dewormer was good at treating COVID. Yeah. So that's not the meaning of researching, but I mean mostly listening to people's experiences and realizing how that fits my experience as well. So I was like, okay, well, maybe I do have those two labels. And we go back to the notion of labels. I completely understand people who do not like labels, because historically labels have been a tool of oppression. But labels have also been a tool of validation. And in my experience, labels have helped me validate my experience, because when you have a lifetime of being told that your emotions are not true and your perception is wrong, then you end up internalizing it. And then when suddenly someone tells you, hey, actually, no, you're not crazy. You're not, you've been gaslighted your entire life. Here is what you are actually. Here's a label that describes your experience to the T. And that, so in my experience, labels have been an extremely positive and liberating thing. But of course, I also know that that's not the case for everyone. So I think that we should all be able to use the labels however we feel comfortable with. And I think, unfortunately, there's this battle between the labelists and the anti-labelists. And there's very little room for understanding that if it fits you, keep it. If it doesn't fit you, you should have the freedom to not have it. And very often there's not that nuance, and people will fight over, oh, let's abolish gender. Let's abolish neurodivergence or the medical associations with autism, because it's oppressive. And it's like, yeah, it can be perceived as oppressive, but make sure to not erase the disability aspect of it, because that's someone's experience of society.
Because then you have that issue with language, that you basically have smoothed down the language, but you still have the underlying oppression that we were speaking about. And that's the same problem again.
Absolutely. Yeah. So make sure to not remove someone's tool to be able to describe their experience. Because yes, we would all love to not have races anymore, to not talk about race. But until race will be a social marker and will have an effect on your experience of society, then we still need to have the term to talk about it. I would love to not be a Black person, and I aspire to no longer be a Black person, to be a human. But until my Blackness will have an effect on my life, then I need that term, and I need to talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have come full circle, which is great, because we're pretty much at the end of this episode. So that's a good way to round it up. I have one last question, which I'm scared to ask now, but I still will. Do you think it's getting better? Do you think people are becoming more open to different perspectives, or is it more like people are driven into echo chambers more and more?
I think that there are several cycles that are happening at the same time. So there might be like a yearly cycle, and then a 10-year cycle, and then a century cycle. So overall, I think that we tend to get better. But that would be like for the century cycle. So I think that we, as a society, we are more aware and more open-minded than 100 years ago. Caveat,
I would challenge
about
that.
The West.
Yeah, even I mean, in the particular case of trans people in Germany a century ago, so in the 20s, people were more aware and open than they are now.
Yeah.
And then the Nazis took over.
Exactly.
But I guess that's a typical, it's a particular specific case, but yeah.
Yeah, no, that completely makes sense. So maybe the century is not the right scale. So maybe the millennium would be a more
scale. But before colonization?
No.
You're sure?
That's where I was going when I said caveat. I'm talking about the West, because we know that the pre-colonization, there were many civilizations that actually made room and accommodations for people who fell outside of their norms, and they were very often, there was.
All right, so you're making the case that it was better before, then colonization happened, and then it was crap again.
So I say outside of the West, that does not apply. In the West, because 1,000 years ago we were pretty deep into Christian values and oppression. Then I think that applies to the West. But that's why I said caveats, that I'm talking about the West here in terms of being open-minded. But
that makes sense.
For many other reasons. So, but So yeah, my point is that there are different scales and different cycles. So it depends on where you look. If you look at, for instance, on a yearly cycle, then I think that since the event of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter uprising, there is a big, at least, awakening in terms of acknowledging that race has plays still a huge part in today's society. But does that mean that there's not going to be the pendulum coming back in the opposite direction? We don't know. That's why we need to look at cycles. For instance, there was a very negative cycle when Bolsonaro got elected in Brazil, when Trump got elected, when Brexit was voted, all of that around the same time. And that was coming off the back of, oh my God, Obama is president of the United States. We are now in a post-racial society. So we see that there are some cycles that are coming back and forth. So trying to answer your question, are things getting better? It depends on what scale you look at. I think that overall things are getting better, but that doesn't mean that there's not going to be a huge setback at some point that is going to take us hundreds of years ago. The example of the Nazi Germany is a really good one, because if we look at Germany in the 1920s, in terms of being progressive, open-minded, etc., it's almost like, wow, like what? In 100 years, like we've almost gone full circle. They were almost more open-minded and progressive then than now. So how did we get to go so far back? So by saying things are getting better, it is also important to keep in mind that that doesn't mean that we are safe from a Nazi, dark ages again, or something equivalent. And this is almost what we got with Trump. And I don't know if we're clearly out of it yet. I don't think we completely got ourselves out of that risk. We'll see in a few years, but it is completely possible. So I don't like to say things are getting better, because we still need to be really careful.
Yeah, well, thank you. That was a very nuanced answer. I love it. I appreciate it very much. And I love the entire conversation. It was amazing. I can't wait to release it. I'm sure that my viewers and listeners will just absolutely love it. And by the way, if you're a viewer or a listener and have listened to it until this point and you liked it, please leave a comment either on YouTube or like a review on your favorite platform, because that really helps the podcast find more listeners and more amazing guests like Joris. So yeah, thank you for your help, and thank you, Joris, for being here, and I'll see everyone in the next episode.
Thank you very much, Angel.